Hi everyone, and welcome to the first of what will probably end up being a few David Hume recordings. Um, a bit of background: Hume, Scottish philosopher, part of the English Enlightenment period, or what we call the English Enlightenment period at least. Um, and yeah, nervous breakdown, all those things that a good philosopher is supposed to have done. But for our purposes, looking at personal identity, David Hume was a firm believer in the idea of, well, we can't really go beyond the evidence that we receive, and we shouldn't be jumping to any conclusions about anything, even the most commonly held beliefs. And so we'll talk about how that relates to personal identity. Uh, so just to again, provide that little bit of background. Hume is an extreme empirical skeptic. So what we mean by that is Hume is someone who argued that the only thing that we have knowledge of is what our senses or our perceptions tell us. Um, and so he argued, at least, we can't jump to any conclusions beyond the literal things that we perceive. Now, they might be false, and that's fine, but we know nothing beyond our perception, and so that's the only thing that we can take. The issue that Hume has is that a lot of commonly held beliefs do make these they jump to conclusions, we might say, about what our sense data means. So they provide meaning to our sense data when inherently there's actually no meaning to it. So this is his big issue with the way that people commonly refer to the senses, or kind of see the sense data. For him, you can take what your senses or your perception is telling you, but nothing else, nothing beyond that. Okay. So I'm just going to read a relatively short part of this first section, but I think it gives a good basic summary of Hume's idea for personal identity. So I've got the standard form there. So he starts off by saying, the commonly held concept of self is spoken of as something that exists across life. He says, or at least for an extended period of time. That might be years or months. Never mind the email that just popped up. Um, give me one moment. There we go. Now we shouldn't be interrupted by emails popping up. Um, uh, something that exists across the life, uh, or at least for an extended period of time, years, months, weeks, whatever, even hours, or as Hume would probably argue, even minutes. But he then presents the idea that no impression or perception, he uses the word impression, which is why I've put it in, but think of perception and thought, perceptual experience in any way really, exists across life or for an extended period of time. And there's no evidence of anything outside the impressions and perceptions. So therefore, there's no evidence of a concept of self existing across life. This is sort of the main thesis that he's going to be presenting in this first section. There's a lot of twas and that sort of stuff in this reading, tizzes, and um, it's an old English, so try and keep up. And let's get stuck into Hume. If I could do a Scottish accent, I'd do one, but you don't want to hear that. That's not good for anyone. But highlighters at the ready. We're going from the start of the reading, so section 6 of personal identity. There are some philosophers. Sorry, I had to go for it at least a little bit. In all seriousness, now, there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself. So this is the idea that we are, connected very closely with the concept of who we are. This, the uniqueness of you as a person. Self. What makes you you? What makes you different from anyone else? That we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. So this last idea of simplicity, I think, is a good one. the idea of self is something that's so simple. It seems redundant to even ask the question of whether we have a self, whether we have a personal identity. It seems so obvious that we do. We feel like we do, but remember, Hume is not a big fan of jumping to conclusions, particularly trusting something that just feels right. Um, this is worrisome for Hume. So uh, the simplicity, he thinks at least, is hiding the truth, which is that there's actually no evidence for this simplicity. The strongest sensation, the most violent passion, say they, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it more intensely and make us consider their influence on self, either by their pain or pleasure. To attempt a farther proof of this were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from any fact of which we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain if we doubt this. So this is kind of what Hume is pointing out here, is that philosophers who argue for the existence of self are basically saying that, well, you can't even question that because it's what's commonly referred to as a self-evident truth. In other words, this is something that has to be true, but doesn't require evidence. It's kind of, this has to be true for other things to be true. So we have to have this basic ingredient for other things to exist. It's kind of like saying, a triangle has to have three sides. If I said to you why, there's really no answer apart from because a triangle has three sides. This is a self-evident truth. The definition of triangle is a shape of three sides only. And so what Hume is sort of saying here is that these philosophers who do argue for self see it as a primary fact. And all of our experience of the world and all of the knowledge we gain comes from this idea of self. It is something that exists in us. And when we, for example, read a philosophical text, the awakening or the enlightenment that we experience from that is occurring because the self has read it. So it's like, well, how do I provide evidence for the self? Well, you can't, because the self is what gives you evidence for everything. It is the prime entity in the universe. It is the first thing, okay, or at least in your universe. So a lot of the philosophers who argue for self would say, well, you can't possibly provide evidence for this. It must exist. This is a similar argument to ones that have been presented for the existence of God. How this universe is so well designed that it must have been created by an intelligent designer, i.e. God. But who designed God? Well, no one. No one. There must have been a first design that didn't have a designer, and that must be God. Or to borrow on Thomas Aquinas's argument, the first mover argument, there must have been a first mover who didn't need to be moved to trigger the sort of cause and effect of what we see in the universe. There's problems with this, and primarily it's that it's an argument that means that no evidence is ever sought for it, and importantly, it's an argument that presents the idea that no evidence could ever be provided against it. Now, this is something that we have to be very, very careful of in philosophy. Um, you know, there's a difference between an argument being so good that you can't prove it wrong even when you try, and an argument being structured in a way that means that you can't possibly provide evidence for it. This is now becoming a belief, just a blind belief. I could say I believe in God, and nothing that you say will ever change that. Well, we can't have a discussion about the existence of God then, can we? Because I'm not, no matter what you throw at me, I'm not going to allow for that to actually even be considered. So this is problematic. And Hume is very, very weary, or rather worried of anything that's presented as like a primary fact, that this is, the self, and no evidence could be provided against it because no evidence could exist outside the self. Um, So let's continue. Unluckily, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is here explained. Uh, from from what impression could this idea be derived? This question 'tis impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity. So what Hume is saying here is, okay, well, how do I explain perception? How do I explain self without relying on perception? Well, I mean, how do you explain anything without relying on perception? Um, the only way that you can define anything is by the way that it is perceived. And so, this is what he means by it would create a manifest contradiction and absurdity if we were to try and do this. So, what Hume is pointing out here is that self, just like everything else, is inherently linked to perception because nothing can exist without perception. Okay. Um, let's continue. And yet 'tis a question which must necessarily be answered if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible. It must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives. So this is the idea that he's presenting that is sort of commonly held, or other philosophers are arguing that the concept of self is something that exists across life, or throughout the whole course of life. Since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. So if you think of your perceptions or the impressions you have of those perceptions, none of them last forever. And you can think of anything, but it's going to be changing. Um, you're not going to be able to stick with anything for any extended period of time. We're easily distracted. Uh, even focusing on something. A great example is reading the words on the page. It might feel like this is one continual experience, but what it actually is a series of separate experiences being tied together. Okay. And reading words on a page, it's a little bit like, when you draw the little stick figure in the corner of your book and you flick the pages and make it look like it's running. You feel like the person is running. You feel like it's one continuous thing. But when you break it down, well, actually, it's a whole bunch of separate pictures. It just feels different to our experience. Reading is much the same. Uh, it feels like you're getting this continuous notion, but actually what you're getting is individual letters and individual words that each have their own meaning that then link to the next one and link to the next one, just like the picture on one page links to the next, links to the next. It gives the impression of this continued existence, right? This big one idea, but actually it's not. It's a series of separate ones that are constantly changing. So this is what he means by, but there is no impression constant and invariable. Um, Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. Okay, so uh, we never, what Hume is pointing out here is we never have all of these things. We might have multiple of them, but we never have all of them existing at the same time. So we can't say that self is all of these because not all of them exist at the same time. Nor can we say that it's just one of them because whilst one, you might be in pain for an extended period of time, pain doesn't last forever. Okay. And even if you're going to be experiencing long-term pain, the variation of that pain is, the pain is going to vary. It's going to change. And so, again, it's like the pictures on, the stick figure in the corner of the book. It feels like it's continuous, but it's actually not. Um, it cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. So Hume there is kind of coming to his first conclusion. So I'll just read that again. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived. So self can't exist outside of impressions and perceptions, because there's nothing that exists outside of impressions and perceptions. And so therefore this concept of a long-term self that exists across the lifespan, it doesn't exist. There is no such thing. It feels like it does, just like it looks like the little stick figure is running, but that's not actually the evidence. Okay. But Father, what must become of all our particular perceptions upon this hypothesis? All these are different and distinguishable and separate from each other, and may be separately considered, and may exist separately, and have no need of anything to support their existence. Sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought there. Distinct and separable from each other, and may be separately considered, and may exist separately, and have no need of anything to support their existence. So what Hume is pointing out here is that perception is something that does just exist on its own. This is kind of, if you think back to the Armstrong recordings and readings, I talked a lot about the ghosts in the machine when we were talking about the mind-body debate. Do we really need this separate entity? Do we really need the driver to be in the body, or is the body just the body? Is it just doing what it's supposed to do? We really don't need the little man in our head pulling the strings. We're just overcomplicating it. For Hume, you have your perceptions, and you can trust that you have them, but you don't need a self that is having them. Or at the very least, there's no evidence of a self that is having them. There is just evidence of perception. And remember, for Hume, we shouldn't be jumping to any conclusions about anything. Rely only on what you have evidence for. Okay, so after what manner, therefore, do they belong to self, and how are they connected with it? For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception. So this is quite a strange idea. And yeah, sorry, by the way, I should have probably said this at the start of the recording, but I'm not well at the moment, so I keep having these coughing fits. So apologies if the video starts. I'm pausing it a lot to then cough up, small sections of my lungs, and then, pressing record again. So hopefully it comes across as not too jarring. But what Hume, that last sentence that we just read, I think is a really important one. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception. Think about it. Everything that you think, every moment is perception, as long as you are conscious. The only time you're not perceiving anything is, for example, in a deep state of sleep, when you're not even dreaming. That's And do you exist then? Well, this concept of self, this concept of personal identity, not really. That person doesn't exist at that time. Your body exists, absolutely. But because you don't have any perceptions, well, you can't perceive a self either. So, uh, yeah, it's I think it's a really important little part there. And never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, Hume talking about the example I was just giving, so long am I insensible of myself and may truly be said not to exist. So this is quite an extreme idea that Hume is putting forward. He's saying that the self turns off and on. And this is very jarring because the common idea of self is that it is the one constant for us. It's the anchor of ourselves. It's what draws everything together. It's what everything points to. Hume is saying, well, not really. It's what we call the self is just the act of perception for Hume. That's it. You feel like it's more, but it's not. and it goes away anytime you lose consciousness. Then that self that we commonly refer to is gone. And how do we know that? Well, because perception is gone. When we can't perceive, then nothing exists outside of perception. And you might be saying, "Oh yeah, but my physical body is still in the bed." Okay, maybe. Do you know it is? Yeah. How do you know? What evidence do you have to say that it is still in the bed? Okay. And you might say, well, someone saw me when I was sleeping. Creepy, yes. But, um, okay, so someone saw you sleeping. So you're relying on their perception then. This is still relying on perception. It's just not your perception, it's someone else's. Um, you know, this is troublesome. Um, if you don't have perception, you really have nothing, according to Hume. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated, nor do I conceive what is farther requisite to make me a perfect non-entity. So that idea at the end there, a perfect non-entity, what a romantic way for Hume to outline the afterlife for us. So if you didn't work it out from that, Hume is saying that there certainly is no afterlife, um, and that death is the perfect example of the end of everything, because does the world continue to spin after you die? Who knows? You never will. You will never know what happens after you die, according to Hume at least. That's it. With perception gone, so is everything else. Okay? Um, if anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain that there is no such principle in me. So what's interesting here is that Hume is saying that, well, he's only going with what the evidence is giving him. He has no evidence of anyone else's sense of perception. He only has evidence of his. And so if you're sitting there going, no, well, I firmly perceive a continuous self, Hume is saying, uh, okay, but I don't. And all I can really talk about is me, because I don't know what's going on inside you. I don't know what perceptions you have. I'm saying that nothing exists beyond my perception. If you're saying that something does exist beyond your perception, cool. I can't imagine what that is. But if that's the case, cool. You go your way, I'll go mine. But whatever it is that exists within you, that you feel like exists across the lifespan, it doesn't exist within me. So I don't have the same personal identity. Why you have it and I don't, who knows? So this is what he's saying. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. So here Hume kind of moves past this idea of, well, you might have it, but I don't. And he sort of says, well, it kind of makes more sense that everyone would be the same. And it's probably fair to assume that the rest of mankind is like me, that, they perceive things in the same way that I do. And whilst they might feel like there's a continual self, when they scratch the surface of perception, there actually isn't. Okay. And so, yeah, there are probably going to be some, you know, scallywag metaphysical or metaphysician philosophers, who are arguing for the existence of some, outside form of reality. Descartes would be a good example of this as a dualist. But really, for Hume, the only way you could make that argument is by jumping to conclusions, which is something he doesn't want to do. So he's going to leave them to themselves. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change. Nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterable, the same perhaps for one moment. So he's laying out this idea of perception being one of a process of just constant variance. Okay, so um, every time our eyes move the slightest amount, which is just constantly. Like if you think about how often your eyes move, that you know, think of how long you can just stare at one thing without your eyes moving or blinking. That's the absolute longest that visual perception is constant. Okay, the absolute longest. Um, Most of the time we're blinking continuously, our eyes dart continuously, so our visual perception is changing constantly. And Hume is saying the same is true of our thoughts and basically everything else. It's just changing continuously. It feels netted together. It feels like one thing, just like the stick figure in the book. Okay, but it's actually a bunch of separate things. Um, the mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in different. Uh, Whatever natural propension we may have to imagine the simplicity and identity. So sorry, I just had to pause for a coughing fit. So there is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in different. So he's coming back to this idea of simplicity and identity, which is what was right at the start of the reading. The comparison of the theatre must not mislead us. They are the successive perceptions only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented or of the materials of which it's composed. So here he uses this idea of the theater of the mind, which has popped up in the mind body debate readings. But Hume is saying don't confuse this though, because when the actors go home and the pit is empty and there's no musicians anymore and everything like that, the physical theater still exists, right? That stage is still there even though no one's on it. Hume is saying you can't think of self like that. Okay, the self isn't this theater where things happen. Things just happen. There is no actual theater. It feels like, well, it must be the case. There must be some sort of medium through which this happens, right? No. Hume is saying there's no evidence of any such medium. And so, no, that's not the case at all. Feels jarring, feels odd, but we don't have any evidence for anything beyond our perception, and our perception is constantly changing. So the self must be in perception if it exists at all, because that's all that exists. And because it's constantly changing, it means that the concept of self does not extend or does not go for an extended period of time or exist across the lifespan. All right, we'll leave the first Hume reading there. We'll continue on with our favourite Scottish philosopher later on. So tune into the next reading, like and subscribe as always, and I'll see you in class.